Thus, cultural and social norms play a highly influential role in shaping individual behavior, including the use of violence. These norms can protect against violence. However, they can also support and encourage the use of it. As South Africa observes the 16 days of activism, one of the ways in which we can help reduce gender-based violence is to challenge cultural and social standards. But is there enough room to allow a change? To discuss this further, I'm joined in studio by traditional Healer Mkhulu MaKhanya and via Zoom Director for Programs at Institute for Healing Memories, Fatima Swartz. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Let's just begin with you, Fatima. When you really look at gender-based violence, we certainly cannot have this conversation in isolation without looking at the role that is also played by some of the cultural beliefs in contributing to the scourge further.
Yes, it's very important that we actually look at the cultural behavior, traditions that people have in their lives, which includes how people talk about and with each other about issues, language, religion, and all kinds of practices that people have. But also subcultures in society, for instance, on the Western Cape, here in the Western Cape, we have to look at the subculture of gangsterism and the kind of behavior that is perpetuated there and how it impacts on people. But also that our cultural norms and practices comes also via education. It's not just in our schools, at our homes where we are taught certain ways or not taught that this behavior is modeled to us, Lots of these ways in which people behave and live on this earth is not verbally taught in a class, but is what young children observe and then grow into. It's what they then take on. And so it is very difficult because these cultural practices and norms are part of the identity. And we all know that identity plays a very important role in how people perceive themselves and others and relate to others and their sense of self-worth, their sense of their place in the world. So it is a complex issue, and I think it really, at the end of the day, if we do not address it and confront it and identify those practices which supports the idea of violence against women, but also identify those practices which supports the possibility of us being able to dismantle this violence and patriarchy that perpetuates violence against women and children.
And Mkhulu, here in studio, if I can bring you into this particular conversation, when you look at the fact that, as Fatima says, children themselves are still finding, themselves in spaces where they are learning some of these behaviors, because certainly that's where it all begins, as Fatima says. Surely there needs to be a conversation that is then held behind closed doors, because some of these, cultural practices are happening in the homes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm of the opinion that social change happens through culture. And so there has to be a culture that we come up with that sensitizes people, that makes people aware of harmful behaviors that adults have towards each other. Children do not necessarily come up with their own ways of how they're going to behave towards each other, but obviously they watch what adults do, and I think we are in a desperate need for such culture.
And talking about watching what adults do, when you find that sometimes in a setting where a father is not speaking in the most correct tone to his wife in front of the children, that is always going to be problematic, because this is the child that is going to grow up thinking that this is how you actually speak to women.
Mm-hmm. For example, in our culture, we have programs that empower women. When couples get married, there are processes that women are being put through. Unfortunately, then we don't have that for the masculine figure or for the man. And I think that it is time for us to begin to balance things out, to say, in what ways do we empower men so that they also become responsible role models in their homes.
And Fatima, Mkhulu here touches on a very important subject, which is the subject of what is done for the men. And you look at the fact that when you are getting married, for example, there's a lot of emphasis that is put on the woman, on how to behave, on how a wife behaves in the home, but certainly not a lot of conversations are held with men on how they need to behave as fathers in their homes.
That is quite true. And I think, you know, a lot of cultural practices and traditions comes from obviously a context or a history where men played a very important role in keeping their families safe. And at the time it was necessary, you know, it was a different reality in which we lived. That role of men has largely changed over many years, and so some of the practices that we then did is no longer really needed or necessary. You know, it's not any longer in the context, and we don't go through the process of saying, so some of these things are no longer needed. It had a context, and this is why it was the way it was back then. But so we don't engage men on that, and that is the reason why at the Institute we started our campaign, which says #the hands of men, because we realized in terms of working with women that we need to work much more intentionally with men, how they perceive their role, what they think society are expecting of them, because those are the things that are not being worked through, you know, in a changing society. And also because then, tragically, I would almost want to say the word tragically, we badger men and we call them all kinds of names and we call them out. But there hasn't been a transition in terms of, in a changing world, what their role is.
And Mkhulu, when you touch on that very last point as to the calling out of men, the harsh messaging that is being sent towards their direction, and yet, as Fatima says, they have not really been trained on how to deal with this changing world because they've inherited what they inherited in the past. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, I agree. But I think we need to understand that as a country, we are a collective awareness or a collective consciousness that comes from resistance and rebellion. And so our knee-jerk reaction towards social conflict and chaos will always be criticism and violence and fighting. And I'm not in no way suggesting that GBV is not necessarily important and it does not necessarily deserve the type of urgency that people are giving it. But what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to relationship and building homes and transforming families, we need a different type of energy. We need a different type of agency. And I don't think that #men are trash, as Mam Fatima is saying, that criticizing men and degrading them is one way to go about it. Again, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't call a spade, but I think when you come to building families and making children begin, because you're also speaking to young boys, so how do you then raise a child who sees themselves as trash? So I think that when it comes to shaping the awareness of family, preserving safety for women and trying to build healthy families, we definitely need to check how we label ourselves.
And how then do we begin as a country to have conversations with men, right? Especially because, as you say, the #men are trash is not helping in that particular context. But then how do you begin to speak to a man that has been told that a woman's place is probably in the kitchen, not allowed to speak, you have very little of a voice, and trivializing what you are putting forward as a woman as some of the concerns? Where do you begin to speak to a man like that?
I'm happy to see that men have been spoken to in soccer stadiums. Majority of women are found in churches and temples. Majority of men are found in the social setup. And I'd really like to see us getting more into that space and finding billboards and advertisements that speak to men becoming self-aware as protectors of society as people that have a responsibility towards children.
And Fatima, if I can bring you back into this conversation, Mkhulu here in studio is touching on a very important subject of self-awareness for men, because it does appear sometimes that there isn't that particular aspect of self-awareness, particularly on, the harm that is then inflicted on a spouse, for example, with their actions or any other, type of behavior that they may be exerting to their spouses. How important is it for men to be self-aware of harmful behavior, particularly in their homes?
Well, I think we can't stress that enough. And in our own organization, we do quite a bit of popular education around it. How do we move forward for men to unlearn this kind of behavior? It's the same as we need to unlearn the social construct around racism and how we see ourselves. So we need to find a way in which, and that's why I started with the schools, because it doesn't necessarily happen in the homes. People are so entrenched, even in the church, as you were mentioning, that in the work that we're doing on the African continent, the women in the church are taught to be very subservient to the men in the church, to the priest, not to question, they eat first, there's all kinds of little things that points to the fact that men are better or superior and that they are less equal to the men. So there has to be a point where we, definitely within our schooling systems, which are secular, actually put out there a way of learning and language that deconstructs that, because we cannot always depend on the home for that to happen, because that is where people are already set in their ways many times. And then I think there needs to be what social organizations and movements do. There must be massive unlearning campaigns, because it's good, and I agree, it's good to put the messaging out there, but you need to engage with the conversation, because I can see the messaging and I can agree with it. Then I find myself in a situation where that is challenged, and then you revert to old behaviors. So you have to give people ways and means in which to be able to respond in ways which is not non-violent, So, and I think a lot of that can be done by also our churches that are progressive, where they teach couples that gets married, or in other ways, people who are living together, or whatever the case, whatever type of family it is that people have, to be able to negotiate a way in which we can solve our differences in a non-violent way. But I think there's two issues here at play, is that we need to stop the violence urgently, because people are dying and it's damaging generations to come, right? And the other thing is that we need to work systemically on the issue of dismantling, of course, patriarchy. And none of that is going to happen overnight, So for us but we must be intentional, and we must work at it on a day-to-day basis.
And Fatima, as I bring back this conversation back into studio, Mkhulu, when you look at, some of the cultural practices that continue to be problematic, you're seeing even wife inheritance sometimes, where you're finding a wife losing the husband, and then the brother is now said to be coming in to inherit the wife, almost. Apart from such practices, I mean, we've seen virginity testing and the concerns around that. Where would you say we need to look into when it comes to some of the other cultural practices that continue to be problematic?
I think we can't run away from lobola. We need to find ways in which lobola can evolve. And I think when we, for example, use the words culture and tradition, the assumption is that we're talking about subjects that don't evolve. They don't need to adopt to time. They don't need to adopt to context. So I think it's important that we need to look at that because lobola continues to place so much emphasis on how powerful the man is, on the amount of responsibility that a woman has towards the man. So for me, that's number one. We need to look into how we then position the man and the woman in the home, and look into what's your responsibility, what's my responsibility at home. But lobola for me is a big thing. definitely.
Mkhulu, thank you so much for coming through, and thank you for your time tonight.
Thanks so
That
much.
was traditional healer Mkhulu MaKhanya and Director for Programs at the Institute for Healing Memories, Fatima Swartz. Fatima, thank you so much for your time tonight. We certainly do appreciate